Gabrielle Burkhardt is here again in the News 13 digital studio, here to talk about our latest investigation. Gabby, this one, closer look into the third branch of public safety there, when we think police, fire, and now this third branch, this being the Albuquerque Community Safety Department. Gabby, thanks for being here. It's an interesting thing to take a look into.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, so first thing I wanted to get out to was really just briefly, for those who don't know what ACS, or the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, is. Can you kind of give me a brief rundown of what they are, what they do, how they differ?
Yeah, so ACS is a cabinet-level department. It's the third and newest branch of emergency response for the city of Albuquerque. Now, these folks, they can respond to 911 calls for mental health issues, substance use, and homelessness issues. So now when you call 911 within the city of Albuquerque, it's not just police or AFR, fire crews, who might respond to the call. It could be somebody like who you're seeing on your screen, part of the ACS responders team.
Okay, so just for folks who maybe have not seen this story yet, we'll just give you a look at what it looks like online. This is Gabby's web article. It's called A Look Inside Albuquerque's Unarmed Emergency Response. So right there in the headline, you know, this is, a different kind of team that's going out to these calls now. Got some pictures in here, and then obviously a write-up of the story here as well. So if you haven't checked it out now, you can always see that on krqe.com/investigations. That's where you can check out Gabby and other work that our investigations team has done. But for the purposes of this story here, Gabby, what was the story you were trying to tell? Again, we know the Albuquerque Community Safety Department is relatively new. I believe it was something that the mayor had first announced during the big throes of the pandemic in 2020, if I'm recalling correctly. But they're relatively new. What was the story you wanted to tell here? What were you aiming to do?
Yeah, so that's when the initial idea for the program launched. They did have some mobile crisis intervention teams early on, but the whole launching of these responders, this department actually launched in September. So it is still relatively new.
Okay.
The main questions we wanted to answer was, we know that the city is tracking monthly data on how they're responding to calls, what kind of calls are they going out to, but we wanted to answer, what is it like to be an ACS responder? What kind of calls are these people being dispatched to? And secondly, are they making an impact? I think that's what everybody wants to know, right? Is it working? Or is this going to be something that ultimately helps public safety in our city? Does it, reduce the calls that maybe police are going to? Does it take some of the load off those police and fire crews? But also, will we maybe see a decrease in homelessness? More people get connected to resources. So all these questions, I kind of went to the department and said, look, we really want to see what it's like. And they gave us pretty good access, which we can get into.
I was going to ask you, what was the type of access that they gave you? Because I don't know if folks know this sometimes, but over the years, access has certainly changed when it comes to just access to government in general and government services. And while there are times when we still go on ride-alongs, for example, with police officers, it is not as easy as you think. Maybe I would just say ask and go. There's a lot of other factors that sometimes go into what governmental entities will allow us to do. So what was the type of access you got? It seemed that you were riding in the back of this car with a cameraman.
Yeah, I was. And like you said, it is more rare these days to get that sort of upfront look in a department like this, but I am really appreciative to the city for allowing us to do this. I mean, we had to sign liability waivers, things like that. So we, understand some of the potential risks that could be involved in doing a ride-along like this. But I was in their vehicle, city vehicle, with a cameraman. Our guy Vince there shot all of this great footage for us. We appreciate that. And we went along in the early morning, I asked them, when are you most busy? When do you get the most calls for service? And they all said, usually during the weekdays in the early mornings, when people are just waking up for the day. This one you're seeing is outside of a dentist office on Louisiana, near Manal. That woman had called in to the city because she was trying to open her dentist office, and there was, just a man sleeping outside, which, a lot of business owners and property owners can probably relate to. we get calls sometimes of people saying, look, I called the city this many times, or I called, police this many times. And now you might start to see people like this respond to those calls. Yeah. So yeah, we had pretty good access. We were able to interview the responders, put mics on them, see the interaction that they were having with some of these folks on the street, and get a firsthand look at what their calls and interactions are like. And then later, after that ride-along day, I interviewed the department director on a separate day with sort of like, we went through the data in that interview, and you can see part of that in my story as well.
Yeah, and just to add another note onto the access, I think that's one of the interesting things that we always deal with when going to do these types of ride-along stories is sometimes is a fear amongst administrators about what their rank and file are doing and what may be caught on camera. So it's interesting you were able to go out there with Walter Adams, Jenny Carrion, these two folks who've worked for this department.
And can I just say one more thing about that, the rank and file, the field responders, because you're right, like these are not, the department heads, which is a lot of times who we in the public hear from, the media as well. And so I really appreciated the opportunity to talk to the people who are in the field taking these calls. Walter and Jenny both come from, kind of service backgrounds. They were very, open with me about why they chose to apply for this job and take on this job. Walter used to work in juvenile detention. So he used to, work with like some of the young juveniles after they'd already been in trouble. And he said, when I saw this department and the opportunity to just, to meet these people where they're at, on the streets before they get into incarceration, before they get in trouble with police. He thought that would be a really valuable service that maybe he could offer to the community. And, Jenny, same thing. She came from a very service oriented background where she used to care for a lot of elder folks. And she left that to take on this role, like I said, to serve the community in a different way. And when I was just talking to them, during our whole ride along, which, the story I think on air is 5 minutes long. I spent, most of the day with them talking about, their perspective of the city. A lot of these issues we see as citizens, I think a lot of us drive by them, right? Like the tent cities, and we don't, we try to probably avoid a lot of these areas and I wonder, I asked that of them, like, do you turn off after your shift is over? And neither of them said they do. Like they're constantly, really they're not afraid to engage and help people and see if they can, get them connected to resources, even on their off shifts. Like they start to get to know these folks, and they'll communicate with people who they know are working on shift and say, hey, can you go check on so-and-so, or hey, so-and-so's not in their usual spot, let me know if you see them, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to mention a little bit. I did get to know Walter and Jenny a lot better during, I feel like, our ride along, and getting that opportunity to talk to them and figure out, what motivates them to do this was really, really enlightening.
Yeah. I think one of the questions that I had for you after doing this ride along was just the sort of whether or not they felt they were being effective out there. I think you allude to this a little bit in the story, the idea of you reach out and you make contact, and maybe it's the 20th time that these guys have run into each other, somebody on the street and somebody with the ACS crew trying to help out. But did you get a sense that maybe even that they felt that the work that they were doing was effective? Because to some degree, I think people are going to look at this story and say, these are people walking up to folks living on the street and asking them if they're okay, and then they leave. And there's not necessarily things that they can do to immediately address the situation besides handing them, say, a contact card or something to get help. So did they feel that the work that they were doing was effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I asked them that multiple times, I think, during this ride along. And in a lot of our calls that I saw them go to, sometimes we would get to like a tent in an alley behind a homeowner who called it in, or, a camp near, again, a residential area. And Walter and Jenny would get there, and no one would be there. And that was the outcome in several of these calls. And I asked, like, do you feel like sometimes that this is a waste of time? And they said, no, because these are calls that would have gone to police. And sometimes we all know we're short, police officers and fire crews as well. That probably would have taken a police officer maybe hours to get to a call like that, because it is lower priority. It's not like a violent crime in action. So in that regard, they do feel like they are making a difference. The other thing I will say is you just saw a quick shot of them interacting with a gentleman outside of a church. So a church had also been one of the callers, and they responded to this gentleman, talked to them briefly, asked, are you out here by choice? His answer was yes. Do you want to get connected to resources? The man was not interested. And when they got back in the vehicle, I asked, do you ever feel like all hope is lost? Do you feel disheartened by these folks telling you that they're not interested in getting help? And their answer was, not really, because they do feel like overall they're making an impact. They realize they have to be in it for the long haul and really build a rapport with these folks on the street. And like the director said, hopefully if they can meet them where they're at and they get these people on a day where, maybe this gentleman will recognize Walter and Jenny after, days or weeks of seeing them interacting, and they feel like more approachable, like this person really does care, wants to help me, then maybe they will get to that point where they'll be able to get in the car, make that decision to seek help. But it is they all admitted to me, like a long-term type of goal that they're all working towards. And it is frustrating, I'm sure, for, not only folks who live in Albuquerque, but the people who call in these calls. And they're like, look, I've called, they came, they responded, but nothing changed. The problem is still there, and these folks are still on the street. So it is hard. Yeah,
that's certainly one of those narratives I know I've heard from folks living in Albuquerque, is that I think a lot of people see the problems just at large. They always want a sense of that of immediate change. And I know that at least Mayor Keller in many situations has sort of said that a lot of these things are investments in time, just broadly how you address problems in the community. That's been his take in many different facets. So with that being said, did anyone actually go and get help or go with these folks that you saw that day?
I really was hoping to get that on camera if it was going to happen during my ride along. It didn't. And, Walter and Jenny did say that it is, probably more rare if you include all of the calls that they go on and extrapolate the ones that are successful. Unfortunately, probably a lot of them are, hundreds, I'll tell you, in the March report, 727.
Let's put that up here on screen, because there are these monthly reports the city releases, with data.
Yes, and this is important because they do want to be transparent and track the types of calls they're going out on, really track the data so that they can, have that information to know if they are being effective. Are they, what kind of calls are they going out to? But yeah, so in March, they responded to 727 calls for an unsheltered individual, which are these homeless calls, which that blue line right above that is February, 375. So that was an exponential increase of calls like that.
I see what you're talking about.
But they also, can respond to
up here
welfare checks. Sometimes they're dispatched by police and fire, and sometimes they can self-dispatch. You saw Jenny with a computer in there, and she's looking at all the calls that the city has in the queue. And I'll read you a couple of these. If you can go to, I don't know if you can scroll to page 6, Chris, in this report. They have this win board that they mention in these monthly reports where they provide a little narrative of these types of calls. So that wellness check that you see, there was a man in Martinez Town Park next to his wheelchair. He had a leg injury. This is something I also heard from Walter and Jenny, was that sometimes you hear her in my story ask, can you feel your toes? A lot of times during the cold winter months, these folks are sleeping on the streets when it's below freezing sometimes. That's dangerous weather that they're outdoor. And so it's hard on their bodies, right? And not all of them seek medical attention, go to the doctor, have, So they're also checking in on those aspects. But in this report, they had a gentleman, let's see, he had a caseworker through Bridge to Success. They called the caseworker, discovered she'd been able to arrange a 2 to 3 month stay for him in a hotel, but they would need help getting to another hotel until the stay could begin. They were told they had a handicap accessible room, but they were unable to identify an available transport service since ACS did not yet have a wheelchair accessible transportation. So the BHRs, that's behavioral health responders, walked him themselves to, I think it was a bus. Am I missing that smart? Yeah. You know, and then they had to call every hotel within a mile radius, widen their search, found another one near I-40 that had availability, walked him to a bus terminal, drove him to the bus stop, waited for him to arrive. When he arrived, they walked him up to his hotel to get him checked in. Contacted his caseworker, updated her. But see, that's a lot of work, right? And that probably took a lot of time. And now, as a result of that, they left an asterisk. ACS has since purchased a wheelchair accessible vehicle that will be available in the coming weeks. So things like that, I think they're, you know, kind of trial and error and they're learning. But the cool thing too that Walter and Jenny and the director shared with me is that they don't have to call an ambulance and like wait for a transport. They can just put these people in their vehicles and say, all right, you're ready to go to a hospital, you're ready to go to a shelter, like let's go right now.
Yeah.
So that's really a valuable resource. But then the other thing is, you know, a lack of resources. Like you heard in just that, you know, quick paragraph narrative, like it takes a lot of effort sometimes to like track down that room. And is a bed available? Does the facility have space immediately? If the person's ready, you don't want to leave them on that street corner and say, oh, I'll check in with you tomorrow. You know, if they're ready to go, you want to make sure they actually have a resource or a shelter they can go to.
These questions, I suppose, may be a little bit too early at this point because obviously you've mentioned this started in September, I believe it was, in earnest in a sense. But I think, do they feel or that enough is being done by just sort of checking in on people, and do they want to do more? Maybe what is that more that this group can try to address?
Well, I think right now they have 45 field responders. Mariela Ruiz Angel, who's the department director, tells me they want to add 50 to 100 more field responders each year. So you can imagine like creating a new department like that is going to be expensive, right? The mayor is asking for an $8.1 million budget hike for ACS, which would double their current budget. The other thing that I spoke to them after I did these interviews about is Jenny, who you see in the car with Walter. They're pretty much like, you know, kind of like police partners, right? But they're not police. Jenny is now moving to the 911 dispatch center, which is interesting because she will be able to see what the 911 dispatchers in that call center are sending people to. And she'll be able to look at the screen of all these calls happening across the city and say, oh, that one you should send ACS to. So they're really trying to sort of bridge that gap for all the emergency response in the city, build a rapport with police, fire crews. I think when this program first launched, the APD union spokesperson said in one of the, it might have been in the Journal, or he was quoted as saying, you know, it's all fun and games until somebody gets injured. And they were, you know, people were rightly worried for these folks who are going into these situations where 95% of the time people on the streets do have a weapon, which we point out in this story. But Mariela Ruiz Angel says that those weapons are usually for self-defense and that they're usually not a threat. Where if you approach somebody in a non-threatening manner like they are, and they're trained professionals, so I'm not saying, you know, everybody should be doing this, but they're trained in, you know, crisis intervention, de-escalation. Some of them are trained, you know, licensed social workers, things like that. So point is, they're still trying to build that rapport, and the more they work on calls alongside police officers, alongside AFR, the director tells me that those, even police now and AFR are sometimes calling in ACS to calls, whereas before, they were sort of unfamiliar, like, what are you guys doing here? You're kind of on our turf sort of thing, until they all get to know each other and realize, like, oh, we can work together. So I think that's their long-term goal.
Yeah. It seems like this is, just the beginnings of an investment that they foresee having a greater impact, but at least right now, this is the investment part, perhaps.
Two other quick things, the director told me at the end of this interview, because I asked, what are the metrics that you're looking at long-term to know that you're making a difference? She really wants to see long-term data that might show police are having to use fewer use of force cases for somebody who might be having a mental episode. They hope to see more people get connected to resources. So they're keeping a close eye on all that data. A few problems I'm sure that people might be aware of that they pointed out is some of these facilities that are out there have a lot of restrictions. Like, you have to be sober in some cases. In some instances, like we were on a call where there was a couple who had camped along the I-40 frontage road. They didn't want to go to a shelter because they said they'd be split up, men and women, split up. In some cases, folks have animals. And so it seems like there's a lot of issues, and this is something new that Albuquerque's trying, and they really hope to see a difference. The other thing that I also felt was interesting that I couldn't fit in the on-air version of the story, so I'll mention it here. We had a shooting in February at West Mesa High School. And when that school shooting happened, or anything like that, in this case, ACS responders went to West Mesa High School. And we covered it that day, where we saw, parents were rightly very worried, concerned, probably a lot of them freaked out in the parking lot, trying to, figure out, was their kid injured? Can you help me? So ACS responded to that school shooting in the parking lot, and they were there more to hand out resources, but also help calm the parents in what was like a very chaotic, hectic scene. Yeah. And the director was telling me after the fact that when they first got there, APS police was kind of like, what are you guys doing here? Kind of like a little wary maybe. She said 30 minutes in, APS police was asking them, like, what can we do to help you more? Like, can you come back? Because maybe we can work together and with these sort of calls. So it's not just, maybe these ones that you're seeing or these types of responses that ACS can handle. Maybe they can continue to respond to those types of crises as well.
Yeah, it feels like while there is some learning for the folks on the streets who maybe are the ones who are targeted for a lot of this help, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done amongst all of the professionals that they work shoulder to shoulder with as well, to show them what they're doing there as well. That is pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Gabby,
public perception too. I mean, maybe a year from now, more people will know what this department is, or just know about them, recognize them. The other goal, she said, if they have more responders, she'd love to assign them area beats, kind of like police officers. So, a team of 2 would have a specific area in the city that's like their area that they cover frequently. So they would get to know, the community members in that particular area of the city. Because right now, Walter and Jenny, I mean, we were all over. We were in the east side, the west side, the northeast,
Yeah.
So I think the goal, too, is if they get some more staff, they want to sort of narrow their focus a little better.
Wow. Well, you can catch the entire investigation, again, if you haven't seen it, on krqe.com/investigations. Gabby, also, where is a good place, or what is a good way that people can reach you?
Yeah, well, you can always email me your news ideas, tips, feedback, gabrielle.burkhart@krqe.com, gburknm on Twitter and Instagram. Feel free to reach out.
All right, Gabby, thank you.